This is Head On. I'm Ian Holmes. Thanks so much for joining me for another edition here on Shaw TV. Well, quite a bit of controversy surrounding the Nanaimo Daily News with a letter to the editor that has spawned quite a bit of outrage, primarily in the First Nations community. A letter written on Monday, which has really erupted into quite a bit of criticism, and also a letter back in March, which led to a protest, in fact, a protest on both occasions, which has led to a community conversation about these letters to the Nanaimo Daily News and the appropriateness surrounding them. So to provide some context towards this conversation, Mark MacDonald, the managing editor of the Nanaimo Daily News. Mark, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thank you.
And also John Swift, Indigenous Studies Instructor at VIU, also a PhD student at the University of Saskatchewan in the Indigenous Studies Department. John, thanks for coming on.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Mark, I'll start with you, and certainly quite a bit of criticism going the Nanaimo Daily News' way. It's from your vantage point, just talk a little bit about why this letter was published, this most recent one specifically.
Yeah, a few things on that, Ian. First, it's interesting that it's the Nanaimo Daily News is targeted. I mean, we ran the other letter to the editor, as did the Vancouver Sun. Nobody's talking to the Vancouver Sun. And this gentleman that wrote in, Mr. McRitchie, was on CKNW for 20 solid minutes. Nobody's protesting CKNW. And that's interesting. You know, I don't know if there's a double standard there, but I think it's really important, Ian, to explain that letters to the editor are not our opinion. It is a public forum. Well, I can't say most, but many of the letters that run in the letters to the editor, I don't agree with. And so we run that line, are we a censor or are we a community gateway? And what the letters are supposed to do is to spark constructive thought. And at times there's been criticism, and particularly in local politics. But I want to always make that distinction. This is the opinion of members of the community. It is not the opinion of the Daily News. It's clearly marked on the page, right? And why I think some of this erupts so bad, I'm not justifying any of the letters that we run, any of them, is the fact that they say, well, it's a member of the Daily News. Now, if it was a member of the Daily News, that's a totally different issue, right? If it was in an editorial, totally different issue, right? But these are open opinions of members of the community, and it's part of free speech. And the way I explain it is, look, democracy has its warts, right? But we do have freedom of speech in this country, and this is one of the forums that we allow for that. And we have an excellent example, a letter that ran the week before. A gentleman was trying to get some, he had a smart meter installed in his house while he was not away. And it screwed up his electrical, and that he comes back and BC Hydro says, okay, your electrical needs to be fixed and we're going to charge you for that. He comes to the paper, we do a story on that, and then he writes about how the freedom of the press was the last thing I could go to. So really it's an issue of freedom of the press, right? It's not our opinion. We don't stand behind any letter. The concept of letters to the editor is an opportunity for the public to speak on issues that they deem important.
Okay, John, I'll turn that now to you. You heard Mark's stance on this, freedom of the press, an opportunity for people to let their feelings known and get out there to the broader community. What's your response to that?
Well, you know, first I'd like to thank Shaw Cable for creating this space for this kind of dialogue. It's very important. And, you know, some of the comments I'm going to be making today are going to be talking to larger social political issues and a history of colonization, especially colonization within Canada. And offer my perspective, you know, related to this situation on that. So, you know, like good advertising, for racism to be successful, racism requires platforms. You know, you need people creating racism, you need people selling racism, and you need people consuming racism for racism to stay alive, right? So in the case of the Nanaimo Daily Free Press, has seemingly agreed to be that platform under the guise of free speech laws, at least in the eyes of the people who showed up in protest. So if we look at free speech laws within Canada, which is very important to consider because, you know, the comments our guest has made here, within Canada, you know, the protection given to free speech is not absolute, right? So that means it has limitations. You can only go so far with free speech. So when I looked at what constitutes hate speech in my interpretation of the first letter published by the paper, it would seem to fit the criteria for hate speech due to its links to supporting the continued genocide of Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, right? Now, regarding the second letter, I hadn't had a chance to read it because it got pulled off the internet before I could take a look at it myself. But, you know, within this conversation, you know, I have a concern as You know, a more important question comes to mind out of this, and why are there no legal consequences for people who are responsible for writing and publishing hate and genocidal material? You know, I believe that the Canadian Criminal Code calls for this type of behavior to be dealt with as a criminal act, but we haven't seen any response, you know, from RCMP in regards to this matter, which is another issue in itself. You know, so that would be my response to that question.
Right, and when the first letter came along, it wasn't deemed very highly critical, but it didn't get to that where the RCMP got involved and deemed it as speech to investigate it as such. So that's an interesting point. So is that the aspect of the letter, just that you felt it was a focused attack?
Well, you know, it comes down to shades of gray of an interpretation. If you look at the interpretation of what genocide is under UN and what Canada, they're both different. Canada has refined, made smaller the interpretation of genocide. So when we look at that, and you know, you look at the letter that was published, there's clear indications in that first letter that was published that you could easily make links to, you know, acts of genocide and continued acts of genocide against Indigenous people. And you know, under the laws of Canada, that is a criminal offense. And you know, but we don't see it being dealt with. So.
What's your response to that?
Well, I categorically deny that there's issues of genocide or racism in those letters. These are opinions of members of the community. And I'm not, so let me make this clear. We are not justifying any of the letters. The Don Olson letter, as I understand it, looks like it may have been a condensation of a book that was written by two University of Alberta professors called Disrobing the Aboriginal Industry. Now, I'm not justifying that, but that seems to be the context of that. This is not hate literature, and that's one of the things that I've been talking about when I was talking with the media. This is not hate literature. This is it's starting a conversation that needs to be held. But every time something is raised regarding Aboriginal issues does not mean it's racism. And I can tell you for a fact, when the letters that we get in there, whenever that charge is leveled out there, we get a barrage of letters. What do you mean I can't speak my mind in this country? Right? So the use of the word is inflammatory on the other thing. If it's designed to shut down free speech, well, then in some ways it's effective. But I can tell you it evokes kind of responses. And that's why I brought up the reason that the letter, there's one letter that didn't run, and the one that did from Mr. McRitchie was in response to the positive story that I wrote in our editorial, right? So they see that as this is something to respond to. So I don't, and when I hear the word racism, I go, hold it. You know, that's somebody's opinion. Those are very serious charges, which I stand against.
So it sounds from what you're saying, this isn't racism, and you're saying it is. It's that gray area. This is a subject of that, in some cases, is up to interpretation. It's how one reads the information, how one portrays it, it sounds like, John.
Well, you know, it's interesting. I like the point that you made regarding racism, and you know, is it in Canadian institutions? You know, is racism in everyday culture? Is racism part of Canada? You know, those are important questions to consider when you're looking at issues like this. You know, because if you look at the works of Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars in Canada, United States, and different parts of the world, you know, they'll say that racism is an integral part of colonialism. So in other words, as long as colonialism exists, so will racism. And guess what? Canada is built on colonialism, and racism works to maintain a grossly oppressive relationship between settlers and Indigenous people on Turtle Island. Turtle Island being what is now called Canada and the United States. So by oppression, I mean genocide. And when I say genocide, I mean, you know, the murdering of Indigenous people for the sole purpose of stealing their homelands, and then imprisoning and oppressing the survivors in concentration camps, which we now call reservations, to minimize and control the threat of retaliation in response to these acts of war against their people, right? If you go back to the old treaties, the old number treaties that established the relationship between settlers and Indigenous people of this country, this is not the vision that our ancestors had. This is not the relationship that they wanted, right? You know, but you know, so for us to move beyond racism, you have to really get rid of colonialism, because within colonialism, racism plays a very specific role. of creating a superior and inferior class of people.
All right, in the interest of time, we have to move on here. Mark, I want to bring up this point about, and something that Chief Doug White said to me during an interview outside the Nanaimo Daily News office the other day. It was the timing of this letter coming out being very questionable. There was a very high-profile local reconciliation event at VIU, and this letter comes out on the Monday, and he felt like, hey, this isn't a coincidence here. What is your response to that charge?
Okay, I'll answer that question. I just want to address the issue of colonialism, and I'm just going to tell you, John, as the response that we get, and if we want to start a dialogue in this country to address past wrongs, the future, then if we continue to use inflammatory words, then all it does is it raises the hackles on both sides. When you use racism, you have people that have been raised under the teaching or indoctrination or understanding of the way things came to pass, now called colonialism. That's their reality. And that's why we offered the pages of the paper to change the conversation. But if you continue to use the word colonization, then you're going to get a reaction. I mean, I know that. We get that all the time. How dare you think? We came to this country with nothing. We get this all the time. And I've worked hard, and so those are the part of the conversations. And that's where, I think I mentioned to you earlier, like we have, last spring, we offered the Nanaimo an opportunity to change the conversation. And we have Tracy Samra has just come forward and she's a lawyer. She's a Cree, of Cree descent, and married to an East Indian man, and she's going to write an article every week about First Nations things, and it's exactly what we've been looking for to change the conversation, right? Mm-hmm. So anyway,
I don't mean to interrupt you, but just on that point about the timing of this letter coming out.
The timing was completely coincidental as far as the running of the letter. I resent the fact that it was insinuated, and actually you did it on Twitter as well. You said, "Oh, I think this is to raise the thing of the paper." When the real fact was this, that I ran that editorial last week in Reconciliation Week to highlight some of the successes and the great successes of the West Bank First Nation. In other words, here's a shining example, right? This is what can be done. And the response to that was the two letters that came in. One of them was the McWhinney letter. So it had nothing to do with that. And as far as space goes, we had space for that number of letters that day, and we didn't run another one. So we didn't have a pile of letters that we said, oh, we're going to pick this one and that one. We just didn't have, right?
Quickly, John, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, well, it's interesting just the language. When I was looking at the language of reconciliation, the definition is a reestablishing of cordial relations. If you look up cordial, the adjective is warm and friendly. The noun, a comforting and pleasant tasting medicine. Now, looking at the meaning of reconciliation and cordial, the letters and behaviors of those involved in producing this material that's in question seems to be in direct conflict with the state's vision of reconciliation, which seems to be problematic, right? Mm-hmm. There's a tension there that, isn't being explained in the comments that I see in the Nanaimo Daily Free Press or, in the comments that we're having in this dialogue here. And particularly, do I think that these letters have set anything back? Have they stalled reconciliation?
Right, and that's the next question. Address that, John, quickly. We have a couple more minutes, and you'll have a chance to respond, Mark. Go ahead.
Rather, the way I see it, there's always people who see it as their responsibility to reinforce the status quo. In this case, racism. Regardless if it's in their best interest or not. There'll always be people willing to construct platforms for them to speak from, or at least within the context of colonization, which is how a lot of people are perceiving the relationship between settlers and Indigenous people within this country, right? Now, I'm not as optimistic as some people about the motives of the state-sanctioned reconciliation movement, but that's not to say that there aren't good things coming out of it, right? Okay. For example, networking and a new awareness and curiosity, but more importantly, it creates a space of people being able to really question racism. What is racism? What role does racism play in our society? What role does it play in Nanaimo? Where do we see racism? Do I incorporate racism in my life? And if I do, is that something that I want to pass on to future generations? And how do I pass it on? And if I come to some kind of conclusion or thinking about that, so what do I got to do next to remove racism? Because to say that racism doesn't exist in Canada and it's not part of the institutions or the way power dynamics are maintained within this country is false. Racism does play a very specific role, and not just within Canada, United States. Wherever you see colonization or oppressive power, you see racism.
John, I'll let Mark finish off here. This latest letter to the Nanaimo Daily News, does that hamper reconciliation efforts? Or can something positive be generated here? You've got about 30 seconds here for you.
I mean, I think something very positive can come from it, and a great start for that is Tracy Samuelsing. But you know, I want to point out we've written since the Olson letter, we've written 103 articles in our paper about Nanaimo First Nations, referenced or about them directly, and 48 specifically on Doug White. We've done what we can without getting assistance from them to change the conversation. We believe the Tracy Samra letter is going to start that re-education process, right? But yeah, so I think that it's something that can foster positive communication and towards the future.
Thanks so much. We're flat out of time. Should be a 30-minute show. Maybe it will, but someday soon here. Thanks, guys, for coming on.
Thank you.
Mark MacDonald, Managing Editor of the Nanaimo Daily News, and also John Swift, Indigenous Studies Instructor at VIU. That's it. Out of time. Another edition of Head On here on Shaw TV.